So, what is neuro-locked? There you go. Making words up again. Yes, totally made this up. As far as I know, I'm the only one that has crafted this terminology. If someone else has used it before, cuff me, you got me, okay? I ripped it off. Anyway, neuro-locked, in terms of making up a word or a definition, or is simply to allow for the best selection of interventions that you know how to do. Doesn't matter if anybody else knows how to do them. And in fact, will create simplicity, but no more simplicity than what's required. Einstein has a quote, "Make things as simple as possible, but no simpler." Well, what we find is that when you look at categories that we can use or will be able to describe them as a mobility limitation, that will tell us that mobility, as defined by the laws of physics, should you have a different definition, I think you should just say you're using definitions that do not apply to the laws of physics, is that an uncontrolled system's ability to achieve motion. That is mobility. There can be a lot of different things that limit that. So if you go through your keen movement evaluation and you find that an elbow has relatively the same degree of limitation when the system is unloaded. Maybe you're on your back, you're on your side, you're prone, and you measure it and it's underwater. You're not happy. And then somehow you measure it with a system where the spine is suspended. It's a quadruped system. So now you've changed the stabilization demands and the elbow still measures the same. So you're seeing consistency. And then you move on to a kneeling or a sitting position where the spine is stacked over the pelvis and you still see the same mobility restriction. And then you do it in standing and you test it in all different positions within those four categories. And if it's the same every time, that qualifies as a mobility restriction. Apply whatever mobility modality you have or what you think is a mobility restriction. It has zero connection to control. Now, here's the thing. You may be able to further compartmentalize mobility so you can best pick the different interventions that you have. So you probably do need to be able to categorize the interventions that you have based on the specific target outside of the brain that they are targeting. Such as, if when I bend my elbow and I feel across the triceps or the anconeus or the back of the elbow, we can suggest that that is a more of a tissue extensibility dysfunction, because as I flex, the areas that are getting long is where I have a sensation. Even if you have pain, we can put that into yet another category, because pain can always be associated with all of these different characteristics. That being said, we now have tissue extensibility limitations. But what if I happen to feel it like I do, right in the middle of my elbow, or kind of like on the side? So as long, maybe where the joint is closing and decreasing the angle. Well, as long as I don't feel it back here, we can call that a joint mobility dysfunction, all right? So you might have different techniques that in your brain and through your hands or needles or whatever that you might target tissue versus the joint. So some joint methods, obviously manipulation, things that we learn from Mulligan, things that we learn from Maitland or Stanley Paris. I always want to tell the story. When I was going through physical therapy school, one of the orthopedic instructors said I was a young Stanley Paris. I am still not sure if that is a good or a bad thing. Anyway, anything can work for anything, but you can be quick and start to look like a little bit of a magician, because remember, magic is just what somebody else doesn't understand. When you can create a solution very, very quickly because you're noticing patterns and you're noticing different things that tell you to go to someplace really, really quickly. So you'll apply the joint, because if you're really targeting the connective tissue that aligns the joint, you're not going to get an immediate response with either a tissue extensibility technique, all of our soft tissue techniques, of which there are dozens, versus joint. So even if you manipulate a joint, all of a sudden it moves. You just picked something that you called a joint based on where the symptoms were. You can't create changes in connective tissue in one technique, but you can change movement. Well, if that really happened, then what was it? It couldn't have been that the joint was restricted through the connective tissue. But what we can say is that the nervous systems, remember this is a passive level of control over the joint's ability to move. The nervous system was simply in some level of protective engagement of that joint. Because if you manipulate and it moves, what did you really affect? You picked what you thought was a joint, and then your brain and your mind, etc., I'm doing something to the joint to get it to move. I don't think anything wrong with that. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that you're affecting the central nervous system. You're affecting the brain. That's why sometimes when you have these tissue categories and you have joint categories, either one can actually be neuro-locked, where the joint is expressing your symptoms, so you're going to pick some different things. The tissue is expressing different things, you'll pick whatever you want. But ultimately, things like breathing, things that we see in other models, if they work like that to increase motion, I don't think you improved mobility or motor control. You just removed a barrier, which is actually the first way you would access all the different characteristics of the sequential process of motor skill acquisition. And that's very, very important to appreciate, because if you put somebody on their back in some funky position and you have them breathe 10 to 15 times and all of a sudden they can touch their toes or bend their elbow, what did you do? You affected the nervous system through whatever potential means that was. That doesn't necessarily make it a motor control limitation. You can still call it a mobility restriction. Now, if that doesn't work, what did it cost you? It cost you 5 seconds to smash a spine. It cost you a minute to get some breaths. If it didn't work, then you are looking at something that's more connective related, connective tissue related, and other techniques will work. It may be in conjunction with some of those other techniques, because then when you start to stack things with these categories in mind, and again, understanding, we had a video a long time ago that your hands should be trilingual, and understanding where and what the system is trying to tell you so that you can pick the best active exercise. So again, certainly a commentary that manual therapy is, in my mind, obligatory. Any suggestion that, oh, you can do that, we're evolved human beings, we should be able to treat ourselves, that's total nonsense. You certainly need manual therapy. Now, you might need 2 people. You might have somebody to get you to point B, and then point B is carried on to point C from other models. Neuro-locked looks like a mobility restriction. But to best understand the value of the technique is that if it works like that, it probably wasn't a tissue or a joint mediated limitation. Breathing and joint manipulation seem to be some of the most powerful techniques that can create this instant dramatic response. Those would put into categories of neuro-locked. And lastly, you can go to neuro-locked immediately when you have a joint limitation, what appears to be mobility. It's consistent across all different positions, but you don't feel it on either side. It's just stuck. There's tons of other characteristics of morphology and how individuals carriage their skeletal systems that might push you towards some of these neuro-lock techniques. Whatever works, get them into training as quickly as possible. As quickly as possible means creating categories and being able to make very, very quick solutions based on patterns that you see. Mobility can be tissue, and then we didn't talk about that, maybe another video, that tissue in terms of neural tissue versus other types of myofascial connective tissue. Those are 2 completely different stimulus. They should be looked upon differently. Then you have the joint, where you have closing joint symptoms. But any category of those 2 could also be neuro-locked if you have those techniques. And this question was generated by what other techniques can we be using that seem to apply to this neuro-locked characteristic of joint restriction. Hope that makes sense. Anybody seen the Leprechaun? Say yeah.